I'm going to put you on the spot right out of the gate here. Don't think about it too much. Just answer honestly. Do you remember what you did yesterday?
Oh, wow. Just jumping straight into the deep end. Huh?
Yeah.
Give me a second. My brain is currently trying to locate yesterday's folder. And apparently the indexing system is down right now.
It's buffering. I can literally see the loading reel spinning behind your eyes.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, the problem isn't that I have amnesia or anything.
Yeah.
The problem is that yesterday just isn't stored in my brain as a neat chronological list.
Right, yeah.
When you ask that question, I am suddenly looking at a totally chaotic pile of fragments. I'm remembering the taste of a really mediocre coffee, a vague sense of mild panic about an unread email.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, a very specific problem involving my internet router dropping the signal and a late night snack that I absolutely didn't need.
Yeah.
So my brain is just trying to figure out which of these fragments you actually care about.
That hesitation, though, that exact moment of cognitive buffering you just experienced, that is the central phenomenon we are unpacking in today's deep dive.
Okay.
Because I asked you a beautifully simple, incredibly common question. You're a native English speaker sitting here in a comfortable studio, and still you hesitated.
I did, yeah.
Your brain had to sift through the noise to find a narrative. But when we look at the source material on language learning, we see that for someone speaking English as a second language, this question isn't just a slight bump in the road.
No, it's not.
It is often a complete conversational red block.
It triggers an active freeze response. I see it all the time.
I've seen it happen time and time again, too. You have an English learner who is incredibly dedicated. They have spent months, maybe years, memorizing past tense verbs.
Right.
They know the irregular forms. They can sit down and ace a written grammar test on the past perfect continuous. But the moment a colleague at the water cooler casually asks, how was your day, or what did you do yesterday, all that theoretical grammar just completely evaporates.
Oh, totally. Their mind goes totally blank. They stare into space and they just say, it was good.
Yeah.
And then the conversation just suffers this quiet, awkward death. So my question for you is, why does knowing the mechanics of the language not translate into actually knowing what to say?
I think we fundamentally misunderstand what is happening in that moment of panic. We tend to assume that the learner is struggling with a lack of vocabulary or, they're terrified of conjugating a verb incorrectly.
Right, like a grammar block.
Exactly. And while grammar anxiety is definitely real, the root of the problem is actually about how we interpret the question itself.
Okay, how so?
When a non-native speaker hears, "What did you do yesterday?" they often feel this immense, immediate pressure to provide a factual, chronological inventory of their activities. They think they are being asked for a schedule.
It feels like an interrogation, like they are suddenly on the witness stand and the prosecutor's demanding, where were you at 2 p.m. and what exactly did you consume?
Yes. And human memory simply does not function like a security camera.
No, it doesn't. We do not record our lives in a sterile chronological log. We remember in emotional peaks and valleys. We remember friction. We remember surprises.
Right.
So when a language learner tries to force their messy, emotionally driven human memory into a rigid, sequential list of facts, and they try to do it in a second language, the cognitive load is just paralyzing.
That makes total sense.
They think they have to report data when what the other person is actually asking for is a shared human experience.
Well, I want to push back on that slightly, or at least explore the learner's perspective for a second.
Sure.
Because if I am speaking a language I'm still mastering, my primary goal is often just basic survival.
Right.
I just want to communicate a concept without making a humiliating mistake.
Yeah.
So retreating into a safe, factual report actually makes logical sense. It's a defense mechanism.
It absolutely is a defense mechanism.
Which is why, in the transcripts from our sources, the typical responses to this question are so painfully brief, like, "It was good, I worked, I stayed home, nothing happened."
Well, and those are, grammatically speaking, flawless sentences.
They are. If you wrote, "I worked on a middle school language exam," you get full marks.
Yeah.
But in adult human interaction, it's a dead end. It gives the listener absolutely nothing to latch onto.
Right.
It's like tossing a ball to someone, but you've covered the ball in grease. They physically cannot catch it no matter how hard they try. You haven't given them a hook to continue the dialogue.
And if the learner realizes this and tries to push past those one-word answers, they usually overcorrect and fall into an even stranger conversational trap. They try to provide the itinerary they think you want. The sources refer to this as the robot diary.
The robot diary. Oh man, I have absolutely been guilty of this when trying to speak conversational Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I get nervous, I rely on the verbs I know, and suddenly I sound like this. I woke up, I worked, I ate lunch, I went home.
Day completed. Nutrients consumed. Powering down.
Literally. It's a recitation of biological and economic functions.
Yeah.
But why does it sound so jarring to the ear? Even if the verbs are conjugated perfectly, it just sounds entirely soulless.
Because it fundamentally lacks the architecture of human storytelling. I mean, think about how we actually experience life.
Okay.
We don't just execute actions in a vacuum. We experience context, we encounter friction, we adapt to unexpected twists, and probably most importantly, we have emotional reactions to those events.
Right.
To sound natural, to sound fluent, you have to inject those unseen elements into your speech. You cannot just list the actions.
You need the background.
Yes. You must provide the background, the struggle, and the ultimate result. You have to explain what those actions meant to you.
Okay, let me test that theory with an example from the research. Imagine a colleague asks about my yesterday, and instead of the robot diary, I say this. Yesterday was pretty busy. I had a few things to finish, but I managed to get most of them done. I was exhausted by the evening, but honestly, it turned out to be a pretty good day.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't use any high-level academic vocabulary, but it feels infinitely more natural. Why?
Because you've unconsciously built a complete narrative arc there.
Yeah.
Let's look at the mechanics of what you just did.
Okay.
First, you established a clear beginning that provides context. You didn't just tell me the time your alarm went off. You set a scene. You said, yesterday was pretty busy. I had a few things to finish.
I'm establishing the weather of the day, so to speak. The vibe.
Exactly. You are orienting the listener. Then you moved into the middle of the story, which is where you introduce effort or friction.
The struggle.
Right. You said, but I managed to get most of them done. We will definitely explore the phrase managed to later, but notice how it implies a struggle.
Yeah.
You weren't a robot passively executing commands. You wrestled with your to-do list. There was an obstacle, and you overcame it.
It's kind of micro-narrative, a tiny daily battle.
And finally, you deliver the conclusion, which provides both a feeling and a final evaluation. You said, I was exhausted by the evening, but honestly, it turned out to be a pretty good day.
So I gave the result.
Right. You weren't just giving me raw data anymore. You were evaluating the data for me. You were telling me how those facts made you feel. Situation, effort, feeling, result.
That structure mirrors how human beings actually process reality, which is why it instantly sounds native.
Exactly.
So instead of leaning on a grammar formula like subject plus past tense, verb plus object, we need to be relying on a conversational framework.
Yes.
The sources point to a really intuitive 4-stage progression that naturally prevents the robot diary. It moves from what happened to what was it like to how did you feel, and finally, how did it end?
It's basically the blueprint for small talk in almost any culture, but especially in English.
But here's where I see a massive hurdle for learners, though. This framework sounds wonderful if you actually had a challenging or eventful day. But what if my day was just an average Tuesday?
Right.
When language learners say nothing happened, they usually aren't being evasive. They literally mean they just went to the office, came home, did a load of laundry, and paid their electricity bill.
Yeah.
They think a lack of a Hollywood plot means they have no right to take up conversational space. Do we always need a dramatic story to sound natural?
Not at all. And that assumption that we need a spectacular narrative to justify speaking is one of the biggest psychological barriers to fluency.
Wow, really?
Oh, yeah. We think we need a car chase or a sudden plot twist to be interesting. But the reality of adult life is that sometimes the plot is just sorting the dark laundry from the light laundry. And that is perfectly valid.
That's a relief to hear.
The key insight here is that leaning into the mundane, quiet details actually makes you sound much more comfortable in the language than trying to artificially inflate your day to sound exciting.
But how do we do that practically? If the plot is just laundry and paying bills, how do I frame that so I don't sound like a robot, but I also don't sound like I'm trying to make laundry sound like an extreme sport?
You acknowledge the quietness. You use natural softening phrases that lower the stakes of the conversation. Instead of saying, I did nothing, which just shuts the door, you say, it was pretty quiet, actually, or nothing major happened.
Okay, that makes sense.
This signals to the listener that you are opting out of the pressure to be entertaining. And then you frame those mundane tasks not as chores, but as quiet accomplishments or moments of restoration.
Give me an example of framing a chore as restoration.
You use the phrasal verb caught up on.
Yeah.
You say, I caught up on some emails, or I caught up on housework. Or perhaps the most universally relatable narrative arc in the modern world, I just stayed in and caught up on sleep.
Oh, absolutely. If someone tells me they caught up on sleep, I instantly empathize. I understand the entire emotional journey of their yesterday.
Because you've shared a feeling disguised as an action. If you say, yesterday was pretty quiet, honestly, nothing major happened, I mostly just stayed in and caught up on some housework, you sound incredibly fluent.
Yeah.
You are participating in the conversation, you are sharing a slice of real life, but you aren't straining to perform.
I really appreciate that perspective because it gives the learner permission to just be normal.
Yeah.
But let's look at the other side of the spectrum. What if the day wasn't quiet? What if it was messy, frustrating, and chaotic? The trap here is that learners often don't have the nuanced vocabulary to complain politely.
Right.
They know words like bad or terrible, so they end up sounding overly dramatic. How do we describe a difficult Tuesday without sounding like we're declaring a state of emergency in the break room?
The social contract of casual conversation requires a very delicate balance here.
Yeah.
You want to be honest about your friction, but you cannot declare the day a total disaster because that places a massive burden on the listener.
Oh, totally.
If you say yesterday was a catastrophe, the other person suddenly feels obligated to play therapist. They don't know if your computer crashed or if a family member is in the hospital.
Right. It spikes their anxiety. Like if I ask a casual acquaintance how their day was and they say, it was a nightmare of existential dread, I am going to slowly back out of the room.
Right, yeah.
I didn't sign up for that level of intensity.
So we need words that accurately describe difficulty, but keep the emotional temperature of the room manageable. Words like frustrating, exhausting, or stressful. But perhaps the most accurate and useful concept for a messy modern day is feeling overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed. It's the heavy word, but it is incredibly precise.
It is. The best way to visualize feeling overwhelmed isn't necessarily one massive crisis. It's a series of minor compounding frictions.
Like what?
Think of it like trying to navigate a crowded train station where the departure boards keep randomly changing.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and you are trying to pull a heavy suitcase, but one of the wheels is broken.
That is the worst feeling.
Right. It's not a life-threatening emergency. You aren't in physical danger.
Yeah.
But the friction is constant. You have to continually recalibrate your path, and it completely drains your cognitive battery.
Yeah.
Too much input, too many tiny demands, and an inability to process it all smoothly.
That broken suitcase wheel is the perfect analogy. Because usually an overwhelming day isn't defined by a massive explosion. It's defined by a simple task completely derailing. Exactly.
Like you set out to do something that should take 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Like organizing a single drawer in your desk.
A completely harmless intention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you open the drawer, you find some loose paper clips, and then you find a folder of old receipts you need to sort. Under the receipts, you find a notebook from 2018.
Oh, no.
Suddenly, you're sitting cross-legged on the floor reading your own deeply embarrassing thoughts from 6 years ago. 2 hours have vanished.
Wow.
The drawer isn't clean, your living room is covered in paper, and your quick chore has turned your apartment into an emotional museum.
Yeah.
The task completely escaped your control.
And that shared experience is exactly why the phrase, "it took longer than expected," is such a vital tool. Saying everything took longer than expected is the most natural, graceful way to explain a frustrating day.
I like that.
Notice what it does psychologically, too. It removes the blame from you. You aren't saying, I failed to manage my time. You are saying, the universe conspired to create friction, and time simply got away from me. It's a universally relatable struggle. So we have a framework for the quiet, mundane day, and a framework for the messy, overwhelming day. What about the surprisingly good day? The day where reality actually exceeds our expectations?
The linguistic mechanics of a surprisingly good day revolve entirely around the concept of pivoting. It is about the contrast between how the day started and how it ended.
Okay, give me a visual for that.
If I were to paint a picture of this, imagine you are walking on a treadmill in a gym. It's functional. It's a bit boring. You know exactly what is going to happen. You just put one foot in front of the other.
Kind of completely predictable routine.
But then suddenly the treadmill seamlessly merges onto a beautiful sunlit hiking trail that you didn't know existed. The functional routine unexpectedly turns into an adventure.
Oh, wow.
A surprisingly good day usually starts with a very basic, mundane plan, and then a bonus track appears. A hidden positive variable changes the trajectory.
The bonus track. I love that. You open the door intending to run a quick errand, and an amazing spontaneous opportunity presents itself.
And the vocabulary we use needs to highlight that pivot.
Yeah.
We rely heavily on adverbs that signal a shift, like unexpectedly or surprisingly.
Right.
But the absolute anchor for this type of story is the phrase "it turned out." As in, it turned out better than I expected.
We are definitely going to put a magnifying glass on "turned out" in a moment, because I see it constantly in the transcripts. But before we get to the specific vocabulary, I think we need to test this narrative theory on ourselves.
Yeah.
If we are sitting here telling learners to escape the robot diary, we need to prove that we can do it without sounding contrived. We need to share our actual yesterdays.
I suspect there is a catch to this.
There is one strict rule. We will call it the rule of reality. Absolutely no AI ideal life stories allowed.
Define the AI ideal life for me in this context.
It's the sterile, perfectly optimized narrative that language learners sometimes invent because they think it was the correct way to answer.
Right.
It sounds like a productivity influencer script. Like, I woke up at 5 a.m., I completed an hour of mindful yoga, I ate a perfectly macro-balanced bowl of oatmeal, I worked with 100% efficiency, I studied 3 chapters of advanced English grammar, and I peacefully went to sleep at 9 p.m.
Right.
No human being actually lives like that. We need real life, we need the broken suitcase wheel, we need friction.
So no curated, filtered social media updates.
Yeah.
Just the messy, unpolished truth.
Exactly.
I accept the challenge.
I will go first to set the baseline. So if you ask me about my yesterday, it was a classic case of derailed intentions.
Okay.
I had this grand, ambitious plan to stay home, absolutely isolate myself from the world, and be incredibly productive. Just me, a pot of coffee, and my laptop.
A solid plan.
But around noon, I ended up getting a random text from a friend who was supposedly just running an errand in my neighborhood.
A notoriously dangerous phrase.
Yeah.
Just in the neighborhood.
Extremely dangerous, because it implies a brief encounter. We were supposed to just grab a quick 15-minute coffee on the corner, but naturally it took much longer than expected.
Of course it did.
We got to talking about a project, and then they mentioned this new, very specific bakery that opened up about a mile down the road, so we decided to walk there.
Right.
And somehow, in a total fugue state, I ended up buying a ridiculous amount of specialized groceries, like 3 different jars of imported olives that I absolutely did not need and definitely did not intend to buy when I woke up.
So your monk-like productive isolation devolved into a spontaneous mile-long olive buying expedition.
That is exactly what happened. So evaluating the result, the day started off feeling a bit messy and frustrating because I felt guilty for abandoning my work. But by the time I walked back to my apartment, I was surprisingly happy about it.
Yeah.
I hadn't crossed anything off my to-do list, but I had a great conversation, a good cup of coffee, and some very fancy olives. It wasn't the day I planned, but it was a good day.
That is a masterclass in the rule of reality.
Yeah.
Let's analyze why that works so well as a piece of communication.
Right.
You established a clear initial intention, the isolation and productivity. You introduced the friction, the friend in the neighborhood. You included a highly specific, slightly humorous detail, the imported olives, which instantly makes the story memorable and human.
The frosting on the cake.
Yes. And finally, you reflected on the contrast between your initial guilt and your ultimate satisfaction. It's infinitely more engaging than simply saying, I met a friend and we went shopping.
Thank you. I submit my olives to the record. Now it is your turn. Give me your unvarnished reality.
All right. My yesterday was essentially a story of minor workplace survival.
Oh boy.
I didn't wake up with any grand ambitions. I just had a very structured, predictable list of administrative tasks. And then right around 11 a.m., multiple small, irritating issues just arrived out of nowhere, all at the exact same time.
It's always at 11 a.m.
Always. It wasn't a singular massive crisis that stops the presses. It was just a swarm of tiny emergencies.
The departure board's all changing at once while you're holding the broken suitcase.
Exactly that feeling.
Yeah.
I honestly felt quite overwhelmed trying to prioritize them because they all demanded immediate attention.
Yeah.
But I forced myself to put my head down, ignore the noise, and I managed to finish the 3 truly critical things by the late afternoon.
Good for you.
Thanks. The rest of the minor fires I just had to accept would continue burning until today. But by the evening, when I finally had a quiet moment sitting on my couch to just decompress, I realized that despite the high stress, the day actually felt really worthwhile. I had navigated the chaos successfully.
I want the listeners to really pay attention to the architecture of what you just did there.
Okay.
You didn't just give me an inventory of your labor. You didn't say, I received 5 urgent emails, I made 3 difficult phone calls, and I finalized a budget report. That S reporting data.
Right.
Instead, you focused entirely on the flow and the feeling of the day. You introduced the conflict, the swarm of tiny emergencies. You used the word overwhelmed to make yourself vulnerable and share the internal struggle.
Yeah.
And then managed to finish. You positioned yourself as someone fighting back against the chaos.
And that is the secret to sounding authentic. The inclusion of those minor hiccups, the shifting priorities, the admission of feeling stressed, that is what makes the language come alive.
Absolutely.
Life is defined by friction. If you try to speak a language without acknowledging friction, you will always sound artificial.
This brings us to a really crucial part of the deep dive. In our stories, we naturally utilized a very specific set of vocabulary.
Yes, we did.
I want to transition into what the sources consider the essential toolkit for talking about the past. But let's be very clear, we are not going to do a traditional dictionary readout.
No dictionaries here.
We are not just giving definitions. We need to explore how these words function psychologically in a conversation and why they are so effective at building a narrative.
A practical mechanical breakdown of the toolkit.
Right.
Where should we begin?
Let's start with a word we use when a day suddenly accelerates. Eventful.
It's eventful. On a surface level, it simply means that a large quantity of things happened.
But I'd argue it carries a very different psychological weight than just saying busy, right? Learners use busy constantly, but it often feels flat.
That's a vital distinction. Busy implies a heavy volume of expected labor or chores.
Right.
If I tell you I was busy, you picture me chained to my desk staring at spreadsheets or spending 6 hours cleaning out my garage. It's tedious.
Yeah, totally tedious.
Eventful, however, implies variety, unpredictability, and often a lack of control over the timeline. It's as when a quiet schedule is suddenly hijacked by a series of distinct, often unrelated occurrences.
So if I wake up expecting to just quietly read a book, but then my neighbor's dog escapes and I have to chase it down the block, and then while I'm doing that, the mail carrier delivers a package meant for someone 3 streets over, and then a pipe starts leaking under my kitchen sink, I wasn't busy in the traditional sense of doing work.
No, not at all.
But my day was highly eventful.
Yes. You were navigating a series of unscripted events. And a beautifully natural sentence you can use to open a conversation is, yesterday was much more eventful than I expected.
Oh, I like that.
Notice what that does to the listener. It immediately piques their curiosity. It stills the conversational equivalent of saying, buckle up, I have a story to tell you. It invites them to ask, oh, what happened?
It's a hook.
Ah.
Okay. Next in the toolkit is a phrasal verb that is an absolute powerhouse for storytelling. Turned out.
Turned out is arguably the most important phrase for shifting a narrative. It describes the final state or result of a situation, specifically when that result contrasts with the initial assumption.
It owes the reveal at the end of a magic trick. It's pulling the cloth off the cage to show the bird has vanished.
That's a great way to visualize it. You use it when the conclusion of the day surprises you. You establish your baseline expectation, reality intervenes, and then you evaluate how things turned out.
So, looking back at my olive buying adventure, I assumed my day would be defined by solitary productivity. Reality shattered that plan. But my final evaluation was positive. So the most sophisticated way to summarize that isn't, in the end, it was good.
Right.
It's saying, it turned out well, or to add even more texture, it turned out better than I expected.
That specific phrase, it turned out better than I expected, is conversational gold for a learner. It allows you to convey complex emotional processing with very simple vocabulary.
Totally.
In 7 words, you communicate that you had a plan, you encountered a deviation, you analyzed the new situation, and you reached a positive conclusion. It demonstrates total mastery of the narrative arc.
It shows that you aren't just reciting facts, you are actively interpreting your own life.
Yes.
Now, the next 2 phrases often work together like a tag team when we are talking about those deviations in our plans. Ran into and ended up.
Let's pull those apart to see how they function. Ran into is the mechanism of chance. It means encountering someone or something without prior planning.
I always feel the need to clarify this for absolute beginners because English idioms can be violent.
Very true.
When we say I ran into my neighbor at the supermarket, we mean our schedules collided and we had a conversation. We absolutely do not mean we physically assaulted them with a shopping cart.
A very necessary clarification. No physical collision is required, only a collision of timelines. You are sitting at a cafe reading a book, you look up, and your former university professor is ordering a coffee.
Yeah.
You didn't schedule a meeting, you ran into them. It's the catalyst for a changing plan.
And when that plan changes, it usually leads us directly to the consequence, which is where we use ended up.
Ended up is brilliant because it describes the final destination of a changing situation, and crucially, it removes the burden of strict intention. You didn't actively plot to do the thing, circumstances guided you there.
So combining them creates this perfectly flowing narrative sentence. I unexpectedly ran into my neighbor, and we ended up talking in the parking lot for 30 minutes.
Notice how perfectly that sentence functions as an excuse or an explanation.
Yeah.
If you come home late and someone asks why, you don't say, I chose to stand in a parking lot.
No.
You say, I ended up talking. It softens your responsibility for the delay. The universe took the wheel.
It's a linguistic shield. That brings us to a phrase you utilize perfectly in your story about surviving your chaotic workplace.
Manage to.
Manage to is all about implying friction without having to explicitly describe every detail of the struggle. It means you succeeded in accomplishing a task, but it acknowledges that the success required significant effort or navigation of obstacles.
It's the linguistic equivalent of letting out a long sigh and wiping sweat from your forehead.
Exactly.
Yes.
Look at the contrast. If you simply say, I finished the report, you are delivering a neutral data point. It was a task, it is done.
Right.
But if you say, I managed to finish the report, you are communicating a hidden backstory. You are telling the listener, the internet went down, my phone wouldn't stop ringing, I had a headache, and the data was corrupted, but I fought through the chaos and achieved victory. It positions you as the hero of your own daily battle. A great natural sentence to practice is, I had a lot going on today, but I managed to get everything done. It acknowledges the weight of the day while celebrating the accomplishment.
It adds instantly relatable human struggle to your narrative.
Okay, the next word in the toolkit is one of my absolute favorite adjectives for processing the past, worthwhile.
Worthwhile is an elevated way of expressing value. It means that an experience justified the time, the energy, or the emotional currency you spent on it.
I want to dig into the nuance here because learners might ask, how is it different from just saying it was worth it? We hear worth it in casual conversation constantly.
They are closely related, but they carry different psychological weights. Worth it is often highly transactional and immediate.
Give me an example.
I stood in line for an hour for this slice of pizza, and it is delicious. It was worth it. It's a simple exchange of cost and reward.
Ah, I see.
Worthwhile, however, implies a deeper, more sustained sense of meaning or personal growth. It's usually attached to investments of time and energy that yield an emotional or intellectual return, even if the process was arduous.
That distinction makes a lot of sense. So looking at your stressful yesterday, you were dealing with a swarm of emergencies, you were overwhelmed. But at the end of the day, knowing you protected your team and kept the project on track gave you a sense of deep satisfaction. The struggle was worthwhile.
Yes, and a beautiful, highly fluent sentence to keep in your conversational arsenal is, it was incredibly tiring, but it felt worthwhile.
Oh, that's a good one.
The power of that sentence is that it shows you you're capable of holding two conflicting emotions simultaneously: physical exhaustion and deep psychological satisfaction. Communicating that kind of complexity makes you sound deeply natural in the language.
Which perfectly transitions to the final phrase in our toolkit, and it actually describes the mental action we are performing right now. Look back on.
To look back on something is to intentionally retrieve a memory and analyze it from your current grounded perspective in the present moment.
It is the act of processing the chaos of the afternoon from the safety and comfort of your evening couch. You are no longer trapped inside the stressful event. You have gained distance, and you are evaluating what it all meant.
That concept of distance is key. When you are inside an event, you are reactive. If you say, I was so furious, you're dragging the listener into the past anger.
Right.
But if you say, when I look back on it, I realize it wasn't a big deal, you are demonstrating growth. You are showing that you have processed the emotion.
A fantastic sentence to bridge the past and the present is, when I look back on it, I'm glad I didn't give up. It connects the historical struggle with your current state of gratitude.
If a learner can begin to naturally integrate that toolkit, understanding the difference between busy and eventful, pivoting with turned out, acknowledging chance with ran into and ended up, showing effort with managed to, evaluating value with worthwhile, and gaining perspective with look back on, they will completely eliminate the robot diary from their speech.
I think we need to demonstrate exactly how powerful that shift can be. Let's move into a practical exercise.
Great idea.
Let's take some of the most common beginner-level, utterly empty sentences that learners use and upgrade them. We're going to show how to transform them so they sound like a native speaker actually telling a story.
A conversational renovation. Let's see the before and after.
Before we start, I want to emphasize a crucial philosophy to everyone listening. Our goal in upgrading these sentences is not to sound academic or fancy.
No, not at all.
We are not trying to cram in $10 words or use bizarre, archaic grammar structures to impress people. The goal is simply to sound more human, more detailed, and more vulnerable.
We are adding texture, not unnecessary complexity.
Exactly. So, transformation number 1. This is the undisputed king of empty answers. The basic sentence is, I had a good day.
It is grammatically impenetrable and conversationally completely dead.
So how do we breathe life into it using our framework?
A much more natural, textured version would be, yesterday was pretty good, actually. I managed to get a few things done and just had a really nice, quiet evening.
That is instantly so much warmer. What is the psychological shift that makes that better?
It works because it provides a complete satisfying shape to the thought. You start with the overall evaluation, softening it slightly to sound natural. You say, yesterday was pretty good, actually.
Right.
But you don't stop there. You provide the evidence, the what, by saying, I managed to get a few things done. You show a little effort.
Yeah.
And then you provide a sense of emotional closure with the result and just had a really nice, quiet evening. You have given the listener a complete mini-story.
And critically, it invites the listener to participate. If you just say, I had a good day, I have to awkwardly force the conversation forward. But with the upgraded version, you've given me multiple hooks.
Yes.
I can naturally reply, oh, what were you working on? Or a quiet evening sounds amazing. Did you watch anything good? You are building a bridge.
You are facilitating the conversation rather than shutting it down.
All right, transformation number 2. Another classic entry straight from the robot diary. I met my friend.
Again, nothing incorrect about it, but it sounds like a line item in a security logbook.
Let us inject some humanity and surprise into it using our new toolkit. The upgraded version is, I unexpectedly ran into an old friend after work, and we ended up talking for almost an hour.
The conversational flavor in that upgraded sentence is phenomenal.
It totally changes the dynamic. By simply adding the adverb unexpectedly and swapping met for the phrasal verb ran into, you immediately introduce the element of spontaneity. It wasn't a rigid appointment on the calendar, it was a surprise encounter. And then, concluding with, ended up talking for almost an hour, illustrates the consequence of that surprise. You allowed your plans to change, you went with the flow.
You've taken a sterile data point, a meeting of two people, and turned it into a spontaneous mini-adventure that reveals something about your priorities.
Okay, the final transformation number 3. This is how we deal with a messy day. The basic sentence is, yesterday was bad.
As we touched on earlier, this is a massive conversational stop sign. It's too heavy, it's too vague, and it forces the listener into an uncomfortable position.
So how do we soften the impact while remaining authentic to the struggle? The upgraded version is, yesterday was a bit frustrating, to be honest, because everything just took longer than expected.
That transformation is brilliant because of how it manages the emotional temperature. First, you downgrade the absolute severity of bad to the much more manageable, a bit frustrating. It is balanced. It communicates to the listener, I was annoyed, but my world is not collapsing. You don't need to panic for me.
And then providing the specific reason, because everything just took longer than expected, is the real magic trick, isn't it?
It is, because it explains the source of the frustration through a universally relatable phenomenon. Everyone on Earth understands the specific pain of a simple task expanding to consume the entire afternoon.
Oh, totally.
You have moved away from a dramatic, isolating declaration of a bad day and invited the listener to bond with you over a shared human experience.
In all 3 of those transformations, the secret ingredient wasn't memorizing a larger vocabulary list. It was understanding context, flow, and emotional resonance. Which leads us to what I believe is the most profound distinction we can make when talking about our past in any language.
Oh, this is the good stuff.
It is the ultimate secret sauce of true fluency.
This is the philosophical core of everything we've discussed today. It is the fundamental difference between reporting your life and reflecting on your life.
Report versus reflect. I want to unpack the psychology of that distinction.
When you are reporting, you are functioning purely as a transmitter of raw data. You are reading the itinerary. I went to the store. I purchased fruit. I returned to my dwelling.
Yeah.
When a learner relies on reporting, They are subconsciously treating the listener like an auditor. They think the listener is just there to verify that the grammar is correct and the timeline makes sense.
Which is why the interaction always feels so cold and transactional.
Exactly. Reflecting, on the other hand, requires a shift in perspective. It means sharing what those events actually meant to you or how they altered your emotional state.
It requires a willingness to tell a story.
Yes, which inherently requires a small degree of vulnerability. You aren't just reciting what occurred in the physical world, you are sharing how you internally experienced what occurred.
I have been turning over an analogy in my head for this, and I think it perfectly captures the dynamic.
Let's hear it.
Relying solely on reporting the events, giving the factual list, is like deciding to bake a completely plain, unflavored sponge cake and then serving it to a guest just like that.
A dry, undecorated sponge cake on a plate.
Yes. Objectively, it meets the definition of a cake. It contains flour, eggs, and sugar. It will provide basic caloric energy, but it is visually boring, it is difficult to swallow, and absolutely no one is excited to eat it.
No one wants that.
Sharing your feelings, providing the context, explaining the friction, and offering your reflections about those events, that is the frosting. That is the rich buttercream, the texture, and the flavor.
The frosting is what transforms a baked good into an actual celebration.
Exactly. To sound truly fluent, to genuinely connect with another human being in English, you cannot just hand them a dry sponge cake of facts. You have to be brave enough to offer the frosting.
Well said.
You have to let them know if the afternoon was surprisingly eventful, if the endless emails made you feel overwhelmed, or if, looking back, the difficult conversation turned out to be completely worthwhile. That emotional context, the frosting, is what makes language delicious and digestible.
I think that is a fantastic visual framework. And if we zoom out and connect this to the broader journey of language acquisition, this fear of applying the frosting is precisely where so many learners get trapped on the intermediate plateau.
Oh, that makes sense.
They have acquired all the necessary ingredients for the cake. They know the vocabulary, they understand the syntax, they can conjugate the verbs perfectly, but they're terrified to use the frosting because it feels unpredictable.
Because grammar has rigid, safe rules. Feelings and reflections are messy and subjective.
But the messiness is the exact space where human connection actually occurs. We don't bond over perfect grammar. We bond over shared friction.
That is the ultimate truth of communication. When you train yourself to reflect rather than just report, you cross a major threshold. You transition from being a cautious student taking a continuous oral exam to an active user of the language.
You stop trying to prove your competence and you start building a relationship.
Which, if we are being honest, is the entire reason any of us put ourselves through the grueling process of learning a language in the first place.
Exactly.
We don't learn English just to pass a test. We learn it to connect with other minds. And that brings me to a final, slightly philosophical thought I want to leave everyone with.
Right.
I was recently reading a fascinating psychological study regarding memory consolidation and narrative. It turns out that the way we choose to talk about our past doesn't just describe our memories, it literally shapes how we remember our own lives.
The language we choose rewrites the internal code of the memory itself.
It does. If you condition yourself to only ever describe your days with empty words like busy, fine, or good, your brain gradually starts to categorize your entire existence as just a gray blur of busy and fine.
Wow.
You strip the texture and the color out of your own history. But by learning to describe yesterday with intentional nuance, by noticing when a mundane routine turns into an unexpectedly good afternoon, or by recognizing that a highly stressful, overwhelming morning was ultimately worthwhile, you actively begin to appreciate the richness of your own life.
That's a beautiful way to look at it.
You stop being a passive observer, and you become the engaged author of your own story.
By giving yourself the vocabulary to articulate the subtle nuances of your day, you force your brain to actually notice those nuances as they are happening. Language doesn't just reflect our perception, it directs our perception.
So we have given you the theoretical framework, and we have given you the practical toolkit. We've shown you how to organize the clutter in your yesterday folder, how to escape the robotic recitation of the robot diary, and how to confidently apply the frosting to the cake.
Now the theory ends, and it is time for you to actually do the work.
This is where the learning becomes real. We want to hear from you.
Oh yeah, we definitely do.
I want every single person listening to this deep dive right now to drop down into the comments section and answer the exact same question that started this entire journey. How was your yesterday?
But we are enforcing the rules.
Yes, the rules are in full effect. Absolutely no curated, perfect AI ideal lives, and definitely no robot diaries. I challenge you to write just 1 or 2 sentences in natural English about your yesterday.
Real life only.
I want to see some reality, I want to see some friction, I want to see some reflection.
If you are staring at a blank screen and feeling that cognitive freeze, use one of the structural string boards we discussed today. You could start simply with, yesterday was, and add a descriptive textured word like eventful, frustrating, or overwhelming, and then tell us why.
Or if your plans shifted, try starting with yesterday turned out to describe a surprising or unexpected result.
You could use the phrase I unexpectedly or I ended up to share a story about how chance changed your trajectory.
Or if you fought a daily battle against the chaos, show us your victory by starting with I managed to.
And if you are feeling particularly reflective from the comfort of today, try starting your sentence with looking back on yesterday.
Exactly. Just pick one of those frameworks, tell us a tiny, authentic story about your Tuesday, your Friday, or whatever day it was. And please remember, as we always emphasize on this show, the ultimate goal here is practice, not perfection.
Yes.
We do not care if you make a minor grammatical error. We are not grading your spelling. We care about the story, and we care about the human connection.
One honest, textured human sentence is more than enough. You don't need fireworks, and you don't need a dramatic plot twist. Sometimes, a quiet, normal yesterday, described with care and reflection, is the most beautiful and relatable thing you can possibly share.
Let us open up those mental folders, shake off the fear of making a mistake, and see what kind of stories we can find. Keep practicing, keep adding the frosting, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.